Choose him, Lady Victoria whispered with a smile sharp enough to draw blood from a reputation. And everyone in this room will know precisely where you belong. Evelyn Carter heard the cruelty beneath the sweetness, but she did not lower her eyes. Beneath the chandeliers of Whitmore Hall, nearly 200 guests stood arranged in glittering circles of silk, black wool, polished shoes, and inherited confidence. Music waited at the edge of silence. So did Thomas Whitmore. He stood alone beside a marble column, dressed more simply than the other gentlemen, his dark coat plain, his expression composed despite the laughter hidden behind jeweled fans. No lady had chosen him. No gentleman expected one to. Evelyn knew that kind of invisibility. Only moments earlier, the eligible men had crossed the ballroom one by one, claiming partners with graceful bows while passing over her as though the daughter of a country doctor were part of the furniture. Lady Victoria had watched it happen with satisfied amusement. Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Blackridge, had watched too. He stood near the fireplace with one hand resting around a crystal glass, tall and motionless beneath the ancestral portraits. He could have ended Evelyn's humiliation with a single step. He had not moved. That silence told her more than any insult could. Evelyn smoothed the faded blue silk at her waist and crossed the floor. Conversations weakened as heads turned. Thomas noticed her approach and looked behind himself, as though certain she must be seeking someone else. Evelyn stopped before him and extended her gloved hand. "Mr. Whitmore, would you honor me with this dance?" The room went still. Thomas stared at her hand, then at her face. "Miss Carter, you are not obliged to rescue me." "I am not rescuing anyone," she replied. "I am choosing my partner." Something quiet changed in his expression. He bowed, not with the careless confidence of a man accustomed to admiration, but with the solemn gratitude of one who understood the cost of her gesture. "Then the honor is mine." The orchestra began. Thomas led her into the waltz carefully, counting beneath his breath. "1, 2, 3, he murmured. "I confess I have always trusted numbers more than my feet." Evelyn's surprise escaped as laughter. It was soft, genuine, and bright enough to make several guests turn again. Across the room, Alexander's fingers tightened around his glass. Lady Victoria was speaking beside him, yet her words no longer reached him. His gaze followed Thomas's hand as it guided Evelyn through the turn. He watched the tension leave her shoulders. He watched candlelight catch in her chestnut hair. He watched her smile at his brother with a warmth he had never earned from her. Alexander had spent 12 weeks telling himself that Evelyn Carter was merely his mother's companion, merely a woman beneath his roof, merely another risk best kept at a distance. But as Thomas drew her through another graceful circle, the Duke felt something cold and unfamiliar settle beneath his ribs. He had never touched her. He had offered her nothing. He had given her every reason to believe she was invisible. Yet seeing her in another man's arms felt less like jealousy than the sudden discovery of a door closing. Lady Victoria followed his stare and smiled without kindness. "How curious," she said. "You never looked at her until your brother did." Alexander did not answer. He could not look away. 12 weeks earlier, Evelyn Carter had arrived at Whitmore Hall beneath a gray December sky, carrying one modest trunk, 2 worn books, and a letter of employment sealed by the Dowager Duchess herself. The estate rose beyond the frozen fields like a dark promise, its stone walls softened only by ivy and the pale smoke curling from its chimneys. Evelyn had expected grandeur. She had not expected silence. The entrance hall seemed to hold its breath around her as servants moved quietly beneath portraits of stern men and elegant women who had never needed to prove they belonged. Eleanor Whitmore received her in a sunlit sitting room overlooking the eastern gardens. The Dowager Duchess was warm, observant, and far less fragile than society believed. Within an hour, she had asked Evelyn about books, music, medicine, and the small town where her father had practiced for nearly 30 years. By supper, Evelyn understood that Eleanor had not hired her merely to read letters or manage appointments. She wanted companionship without flattery. Evelyn could offer that. Alexander Whitmore entered late. He was taller than she had imagined, dressed in black, with the controlled stillness of a man accustomed to obedience. His eyes rested on her for one measured moment. "Miss Carter," he said, "Your Grace, my mother tells me you are well educated. My father believed education should not be wasted merely because a daughter could not inherit his profession. Something almost like approval crossed his face, then vanished. An unusual belief. He was an unusual man. Alexander asked no more. Yet over the following weeks, Evelyn often felt his attention before she saw him. He noticed when she changed the flowers in Eleanor's room, when she returned a servant's dropped glove, when she remained at the library window after sunset with a book open but unread. He saw everything and acknowledged nothing. Evelyn told herself his distance was a kindness. Men of his rank were dangerous not because they intended harm, but because their smallest gestures could become promises to women who had too little security. Still, she began to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the corridor. One evening, while Eleanor rested, Evelyn wandered into the abandoned music room. Dust silvered the piano. A white cloth covered its polished surface like winter snow. She removed it carefully and lifted the lid. The first notes were uncertain. Then memory guided her hands into an old melody her father had loved. The music traveled through the darkened hall. Alexander appeared in the doorway before she finished. His face had changed. For one breath, she saw grief beneath the discipline. Then the mask returned. Who gave you permission to use that instrument? His voice was quiet, which made the rebuke sharper. Evelyn rose at once. No one, Your Grace. I apologize. It belonged to my sister. The words seemed difficult for him. No one has played it since she died. I did not know. A person in your position should not touch what belongs to this family without being invited. Heat reached Evelyn's cheeks, but she kept her chin level. You are correct. She lowered the lid, replaced the cloth, and walked past him without another word. Alexander remained alone in the music room. He had wanted the song to stop. Yet when silence returned, it felt colder than before. 3 days after the music room fell silent, Thomas Whitmore returned to the estate beneath a pale morning sky, arriving without ceremony in a modest carriage that carried more books than luggage. Unlike Alexander, he entered Whitmore Hall as though it were a place to be lived in rather than guarded. He greeted the footmen by name, asked after the kitchen maid whose mother had been ill, and paused in the entrance hall to straighten a crooked landscape painting that no one else appeared to notice. Evelyn first saw him from the upper gallery while Eleanor explained that her younger son had spent the past 2 years overseeing a small family property nearly 100 miles north. Thomas has never cared much for society, Eleanor said, watching him with quiet affection. Society has returned the favor. At luncheon, Thomas wore a dark brown coat that was well made but plainly cut. He spoke without performance, laughed at his own mistakes, and listened when others answered. Alexander sat at the head of the table, composed and distant, while Thomas asked Evelyn about the book beside her plate. A history of rural medicine, she replied. My father kept a copy in his office. Then I should not pretend I understand it, Thomas said. I once fainted while a village doctor described a broken finger. Eleanor smiled. Even Alexander looked up. Evelyn felt laughter rise before she could stop it. Thomas noticed, but he did not stare at her as though he had won something. He merely smiled and continued eating. In the days that followed, Evelyn encountered him everywhere. He carried firewood into the village school because the stable boys were busy. He spent an hour helping the gardener repair a greenhouse latch. He sat with Eleanor in the afternoons and read badly written newspaper articles in voices so solemn that she laughed until tears brightened her eyes. The servants respected him, though the visiting nobles treated his gentleness as evidence of weakness. Evelyn understood the mistake. Thomas did not lack intelligence. He simply possessed no hunger to prove himself superior. One snowy evening, he found her outside the closed music room. My mother says you play, he said. Evelyn looked toward the covered piano. I did. That sounds like a door being shut. Some doors belong to other families. Thomas studied her face, then opened the room without touching her or pressing her for an explanation. The piano belonged to our sister, Margaret, he said. She would have hated the dust more than the music. Evelyn hesitated. The Duke does not agree. Alexander often mistakes silence for protection. Thomas removed the cloth and sat beside the instrument rather than at it. You do not have to play for me, but you should not let one harsh sentence decide what your hands are allowed to remember. After a long moment, Evelyn lowered herself onto the bench. The first notes trembled. Then the melody deepened, warm and clear beneath the candlelight. Thomas listened with his eyes closed. Neither of them saw Alexander standing beyond the half-open door. He had come to object. Instead, He remained in the shadows, hearing Evelyn restore life to the room he had ordered into mourning. Then Thomas whispered something that made her smile, and Alexander discovered that silence could wound as deeply as any spoken word. Alexander left the music room before either of them noticed him, but the melody followed him through the corridor, through the library, and into the private study where the fire had burned low beneath a portrait he had never found the courage to remove. Caroline Hayes looked down from the canvas with the same composed beauty that had once convinced him grace and loyalty were the same thing. 8 years earlier, Alexander had believed himself fortunate. Caroline had known exactly when to smile, when to lower her voice, and when to speak of devotion as though the word belonged only to them. She had accepted his ring before half of London and promised to stand beside him through every difficulty. Then a banking dispute threatened the Whitmore estates, and the truth emerged with humiliating clarity. Caroline had been meeting in secret with Edmund Vale, Alexander's closest friend and legal advisor. Together, they had copied private documents concerning the northern lands and planned to use them to secure a richer alliance if Alexander's fortune collapsed. The scheme failed before the tenants lost their homes, but something inside Alexander did not survive it. Caroline wept when confronted. Edmund apologized. Neither expression moved him. From that winter forward, Alexander trusted contracts more than affection and silence more than promises. He learned to examine kindness for hidden cost. He learned to mistake caution for wisdom. Evelyn Carter had disturbed that discipline from the moment she entered Whitmore Hall. She asked for nothing. That should have reassured him. Instead, it made him search harder for what she might be concealing. 2 mornings after Thomas persuaded her to play again, Alexander received a letter from his London solicitor. The name Carter appeared in a column of unsettled accounts. Dr. Samuel Carter, deceased, had left debts connected to a small rural clinic. The remaining obligation was modest by Whitmore standards, but severe enough to burden a family without property. Alexander read the page twice. By evening, he had built an entire judgment from a few lines of ink. Evelyn had lost her father, inherited financial trouble, and accepted a position beside a wealthy widow. To him, the conclusion felt obvious. To ask her would have required trust. He chose certainty instead. The next day, he found her in Eleanor's morning room arranging correspondence. Sunlight rested across her pale blue dress while she sealed a letter with careful hands. "You have family remaining in Ashford County?" he asked. Evelyn looked up, surprised by the question. "A younger brother. Does he depend upon you?" A pause. "Yes." Alexander heard confirmation where there was only truth. "My mother is generous with those she favors." Evelyn's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Your mother is generous because she is kind. Kindness is sometimes misunderstood as opportunity." The room seemed to lose its warmth. Evelyn set down the seal. "Is there something you wish to accuse me of, Your Grace?" Her directness unsettled him. "I prefer clarity." "Then be clear." Alexander held her gaze, but the words he chose were colder than the suspicion beneath them. "You would be wise to remember that employment in this house does not grant a claim upon this family." Evelyn did not plead. She did not defend herself. She simply rose, dignity straightening her small frame. "I have never mistaken wages for affection, nor shelter for belonging." Then she left him alone beside the letters. Only later did Alexander discover that every dollar she earned beyond her own needs was sent to her brother, who had been ill since childhood, and that the debt attached to her father's name had not been born from gambling or vanity. Dr. Carter had borrowed money to keep his clinic open during a winter epidemic when poor families could not pay. Alexander had judged sacrifice as ambition because betrayal had taught him to see a price behind every act of goodness. He had thought he was protecting his household. In truth, he was protecting the wound he had refused to heal. By the night of the winter ball, Whitmore Hall had been transformed into a cathedral of light. Hundreds of candles burned beneath crystal chandeliers, their reflections multiplying in tall mirrors until the ballroom seemed brighter than noon. Carriages rolled through the snow for nearly an hour, delivering titled families wrapped in velvet, silk, and expectation. Evelyn stood beside Eleanor near the edge of the room, wearing a blue gown the Dowager Duchess had insisted upon lending her. It was elegant but restrained, without jewels beyond a small pearl at her throat. She looked composed. Only the careful stillness of her hands revealed how deeply she felt the weight of so many examining eyes. Lady Victoria Ashford moved through the gathering like a woman already certain of her future. Her silver gown caught every flame, and her smile never faltered as she greeted those whose approval mattered. When she reached Eleanor, she offered Evelyn a glance polished enough to pass for courtesy. "Miss Carter," she said, "how fortunate that Her Grace allows the household to share in the festivities." Evelyn understood the boundary hidden inside the compliment. Her Grace is generous. Indeed, generosity can make the lines of society appear less fixed than they are. Eleanor's expression cooled, but before she could answer, the orchestra announced the opening selection. Lady Victoria lifted one hand and proposed what she called a harmless amusement. The unmarried ladies would remain in a line, while the gentlemen chose their partners in order of rank. Laughter greeted the idea. Evelyn felt the trap before anyone else seemed to recognize it. One by one, the gentlemen crossed the floor. Daughters of earls and barons were selected with practiced bows. Younger women blushed behind their fans. The line shortened. Evelyn remained. Alexander stood near the fireplace speaking with a marquis, though his attention had already shifted toward her. He saw the whispers. He saw one gentleman glance at Evelyn and then turn toward a woman with a better name. He saw Lady Victoria's satisfaction. Thomas stood on the opposite side of the ballroom, equally unchosen, his plain black coat nearly invisible among embroidered waistcoats and jeweled orders. A pair of young ladies laughed softly when he approached, then turned away before he could speak. Evelyn watched his expression remain courteous, but she recognized the familiar wound beneath it. Lady Victoria looked along the nearly empty line and raised her voice just enough to carry. "It appears refinement may be learned, but birth remains difficult to imitate." Several guests smiled. Others lowered their eyes. Eleanor moved as though to intervene, but Evelyn touched her arm gently. "Please." Her dignity was the last thing that belonged entirely to her. Alexander heard every word. One step from him would have ended the cruelty. One invitation would have silenced the room. Yet Caroline's betrayal rose like an old shadow, warning him that public kindness could be mistaken for favor, and favor could become expectation. He remained where he was. Evelyn looked at him once. Not pleading, not hopeful, merely seeing him clearly. His silence answered a question she had never spoken. Lady Victoria's smile deepened. "Perhaps," she said, "some women are better suited to observing a dance than joining one." The orchestra waited. Then Evelyn stepped away from the line. She did not retreat toward the wall. She crossed the center of the ballroom, each measured footstep drawing the attention of the entire room. Thomas looked up as she approached him. Alexander stopped breathing. Evelyn extended her gloved hand and chose the one man everyone else had decided not to see. Thomas looked at Evelyn's hand as though it were an answer to a question he had long ago stopped asking. Around them, the ballroom held its silence with almost theatrical discipline. He could have refused in order to protect her from further gossip. He could have bowed and stepped aside, preserving the comfort of everyone who had already decided what each of them was worth. Instead, he placed his hand beneath hers. "The honor is mine, Miss Carter." The orchestra began cautiously, then settled into a waltz. Thomas guided her onto the floor with greater care than confidence. His first turn was too measured. His second nearly missed the beat. "I should warn you," he murmured. "I have spent most of my life avoiding rooms where people expect elegance." Evelyn felt the eyes upon them, but his honesty loosened something inside her. "Then we have one advantage." "What is that?" "Neither of us has anything left to prove to them." Thomas smiled. "1, 2, 3, he whispered as they moved. "I count when I am nervous." "You hide it well." "That is because I have had years of practice being underestimated." Evelyn laughed before she could stop herself. The sound rose above the music, warm and unguarded. It changed the room more completely than any announcement could have done. Guests who had dismissed her now watched as though uncertain whether they had overlooked beauty or created it through cruelty. Those who had mocked Thomas began to notice the steadiness of his posture, the gentleness with which he gave Evelyn space, and the quiet assurance in every step after the first. They did not suddenly become different people. They merely became visible. Alexander saw it all. From beside the fireplace, he watched his brother guide Evelyn beneath the chandeliers while candlelight moved across the blue silk of her gown. He had seen that dress earlier and thought only that his mother had chosen well. Now every turn seemed to reveal something he had refused to understand. Evelyn was not reaching for rank. She was not performing gratitude. She was simply alive in a way she had never allowed herself to be around him. Thomas said something too softly for Alexander to hear. Evelyn's eyes brightened. Her shoulders relaxed. Her smile remained. Alexander's hand tightened around the stem of his glass. He told himself he was concerned for appearances. He told himself Thomas was too trusting. He told himself Evelyn had chosen the one man in the room least prepared to recognize calculation. Yet none of those thoughts explained why the sight of Thomas's hand near hers filled him with a cold, restless pressure he could neither command nor dismiss. Lady Victoria stepped closer. "You appear distracted, Your Grace." "I am not." "Then perhaps you always watch your brother with such intensity." Alexander did not answer. The waltz carried Evelyn and Thomas past him. For one brief instant, Evelyn's gaze met his. There was no triumph in it, no invitation, only calm distance. Then she turned with Thomas and was gone again into the circle of dancers. Lady Victoria followed the movement with narrowed eyes. "How curious," she said. "You ignored her when she stood alone. Now you cannot bear to see her chosen." The words landed because they were true. Alexander had believed power meant possessing every choice in the room. Yet Evelyn had made one without him. And suddenly the Duke of Blackridge understood what it was to stand outside a closed door. The waltz had not yet ended when Alexander left the fireplace. His movement was quiet, but the room felt it. Conversations thinned as he crossed the polished floor, his black coat cutting through candlelight and silk with the certainty of a man accustomed to doors opening before him. Thomas saw him approach first. His expression remained calm, though his steps slowed by half a beat. Evelyn felt the change and turned. Alexander stopped at the edge of their circle. "Thomas," he said, his voice controlled. "May I?" The question sounded courteous, but command lived beneath it. Thomas did not release Evelyn. Instead, he looked at her. "Miss Carter." That single gesture shifted the balance again. Neither brother would decide for her. Evelyn met Alexander's gaze. For weeks, she had imagined what it might feel like to be noticed by him without suspicion. She had not imagined it would happen only after another man offered her kindness. "The dance is not finished," she said. The chandeliers seemed to brighten above the sudden silence. Alexander's jaw tightened. "I am aware. Then I intend to finish it with the gentleman who accepted my hand." A murmur moved through the guests. Lady Victoria stood near the fireplace, watching with a smile that no longer reached her eyes. Thomas waited, giving Evelyn every chance to change her mind. She did not. Alexander stepped back. It was only a few inches, but for a man who had spent his life controlling every room, it was a public surrender. The orchestra continued. Thomas guided Evelyn into the final turn, though neither of them spoke until the last note faded. He bowed over her hand without touching it to his lips. "Thank you," he said softly, "for the dance. For allowing me to be more than someone else's lesser brother." Evelyn's expression gentled. "You were never lesser." Alexander heard the words. They followed him after the applause began, followed him when Evelyn excused herself, and followed him into the west corridor where tall windows looked out upon the frozen gardens. He found her near the darkened conservatory, one hand resting against the stone ledge as she gathered her composure. "Miss Carter." She turned slowly. "Your Grace." Was that display necessary? The question escaped colder than he intended. Display? Crossing the ballroom. Choosing Thomas. Refusing me before everyone. Evelyn stared at him, disbelief sharpening into quiet anger. "You believe I did all of that for you? I believe you understood how it would appear. I understood that two people had been made invisible for the amusement of your guests. Thomas does not require your pity. I did not pity him. Then why choose him?" Alexander asked. The answer mattered more than he wished to admit. Evelyn stepped closer, not enough to invite intimacy, only enough to make retreat impossible. Because he was kind when kindness offered him no advantage. Because he listened without judging me. Because when the entire room decided he was not worth choosing, I knew they were wrong. Alexander's control slipped. "And you wished to make me jealous." Her eyes changed then. Whatever softness remained disappeared. "You think every action of a woman must revolve around you." He said nothing. She continued, each word quiet and exact. "You watched while Lady Victoria humiliated me. You stood close enough to hear every insult, yet you did not move until your brother made me smile. That is not concern, your grace. It is possession awakened too late. You misunderstand me. No, I believe I finally understand you. Evelyn lifted her chin. You have spent weeks deciding what I am without once asking who I might be. That is why you have never truly seen me. Perhaps you have never truly seen anyone. She passed him before he could answer. Alexander remained alone beneath the cold corridor lamps, listening to her footsteps fade. For the first time in years, he could not blame betrayal, caution, or rank for the emptiness around him. The door had not closed because Thomas stood on the other side. It had closed because Alexander himself had never learned how to enter without demanding ownership. The morning after the ball, Evelyn placed her resignation on Eleanor's writing desk before the first carriage departed Whitmore Hall. Snow pressed softly against the windows, erasing the tracks of guests who had carried their whispers back toward London. Eleanor read the letter in silence, then folded it with care. I will not ask you to stay where you no longer feel respected, she said. But I will ask whether my son's foolishness is the only reason. Evelyn looked toward the fire. Your grace has shown me more kindness than I can repay. Thomas has shown me friendship. But I cannot remain in a house where every quiet moment becomes evidence against me. Eleanor's eyes saddened. Alexander has spent years mistaking suspicion for wisdom. Then he must learn the difference without using me as the lesson. By noon, Thomas found Evelyn in the library packing the few books she had brought. He closed the door gently behind him. My mother told me. Evelyn nodded. I am sorry. Do not be. You are choosing peace. Thomas stood beside the table, his usual ease replaced by a careful seriousness. There is something I should say before you go. I care for you. More than I intended. Evelyn's hand stilled. Thomas, I am not asking for an answer. His smile was quiet and sad. You have had enough men deciding what your feelings ought to be. I only wanted you to know that my kindness was never a bargain. Her eyes brightened. You deserve someone who can return what you offer. Perhaps. And you deserve time enough to know what you want without fear standing beside you. He carried her trunk downstairs himself. Alexander watched from the upper gallery, unseen. Every part of him wanted to descend, command the carriage delayed, and find some argument powerful enough to keep her beneath his roof. Yet Evelyn's words from the corridor returned with merciless clarity. Possession awakened too late. He remained where he was until the front doors closed behind her. That evening, Alexander summoned his solicitor. He asked for every document connected to Dr. Samuel Carter's clinic. The truth arrived in ledgers, letters, and unpaid accounts. Dr. Carter had borrowed money during a winter outbreak so that minors, widows, and children could receive medicine without charge. He had sold his home before allowing the clinic to close. Evelyn had inherited no hidden fortune, only his debt and his principles. Alexander read until dawn. Shame did not arrive dramatically. It settled upon him line by line. He had taken sacrifice for calculation because it was easier than admitting goodness still existed. Before the week ended, he purchased the abandoned clinic from its creditor and placed it into a public trust under Dr. Carter's name. He arranged funding for its reopening, not as a gift to Evelyn, but as restitution to the community her father had served. In the music room, he removed the white cloth from Margaret's piano and ordered it restored. At the next county gathering, Lady Victoria remarked that Miss Carter had been fortunate to leave before ambition betrayed her completely. Alexander faced the room. Miss Carter displayed more dignity in one evening than many titled families manage in a lifetime. Victoria's smile froze. Surely you do not intend to defend a paid companion above your own guests. I intend to correct my own failure, he replied. She was insulted beneath my roof, and I allowed silence to protect my comfort. That silence was cowardice. The room fell still. It was the first truth Alexander had spoken without trying to control its cost. But truth did not bring Evelyn back. Weeks passed. The restored piano waited beneath candlelight. The clinic reopened under winter skies. Alexander did what was right and discovered that righteousness did not purchase forgiveness. Evelyn remained gone. For the first time, he understood that love could not be summoned by title, repaired by money, or secured through regret. It could only be offered freedom and hope to be chosen. 3 months later, the last snow had begun to retreat from Ashford County, leaving narrow roads dark with thawing earth and fields silvered beneath the early spring sun. Evelyn stood outside the newly opened village school, listening to children recite their lessons through windows that had once belonged to an abandoned meeting hall. She had found work there within days of leaving Whitmore Hall, teaching reading, arithmetic, and music to families who could pay little and still apologized for offering less. The life was modest. It was also entirely her own. On the afternoon of the school dedication, carriages arrived from nearby estates, but one man came on horseback without servants, banners, or the black ducal carriage everyone in the county would have recognized. Alexander dismounted at the edge of the yard and remained there until Evelyn saw him. He wore a plain dark coat. In one hand, he carried a narrow parcel wrapped in brown paper. For a moment, neither moved. Then he approached, stopping several feet away as though the distance belonged to her. "Miss Carter, Your Grace, I did not come to ask you to return." Evelyn studied him carefully. "Then why did you come?" Alexander looked toward the schoolhouse, where the sound of children reading drifted into the cool air. "To tell you that your father's clinic has reopened. A board from the village will oversee it. The property belongs to the trust, not to me, and not to you. No one will be able to use it as leverage." Her breath caught, though her expression remained composed. "You learned the truth." "Too late." "Yes." He accepted the word without defense. "I judged your father without knowing him. I judged you because suspicion was easier than trust. I cannot undo that." He offered her the parcel. Inside was the restored sheet music from the melody she had played at Whitmore Hall, its faded pages carefully repaired and bound. "Margaret wrote notes in the margins," he said. "Thomas found them. He thought you should have a copy." As if summoned by his name, Thomas emerged from the schoolhouse carrying a stack of books. He greeted Alexander with a nod, then smiled at Evelyn. There was no bitterness in him. During the months apart, he had written twice, never asking for more than friendship. He understood before either of them that affection was not diminished by refusing to turn it into a claim. That evening, the schoolhouse filled with lantern light for a small celebration. Farmers, shopkeepers, children, and a few local families gathered while a violinist began a simple waltz. Thomas invited an elderly widow to dance, making her laugh before the first turn. Alexander remained near the wall. Once, he would have crossed the room certain that rank gave him the right to be answered. Now he waited. Evelyn watched him through the moving crowd. She saw no demand in his face, no wounded pride, only hope restrained by humility. She crossed the floor and stopped before him. Then she extended her hand. "One dance, Your Grace." Alexander looked at her hand, then at her eyes. "Only if the next one is also your choice." Evelyn smiled. "We will begin with this one." He bowed and accepted. They moved slowly beneath the lanterns, without chandeliers, titles, or an audience waiting to judge who belonged beside whom. Alexander did not hold her as though he feared losing her. He held her as though her freedom was the most precious thing between them. Outside, winter released its final grip upon the fields. Inside, Evelyn chose him not because jealousy had awakened his heart, but because humility had taught it how to love. Some men mistake longing for ownership. A worthy man learns that love begins only when possession ends.